Picture this: a room filled with the most distinguished guests from around the world, crystal chandeliers casting elegant shadows on marble floors, and the soft murmur of sophisticated conversation filling the air. Then suddenly, a 4-year-old prince walks up to a grand piano worth more than most people's houses, sits down with the confidence of a seasoned performer, and delivers a single line that would make international headlines for weeks. What happened next wasn't just a cute royal moment that would be forgotten by morning. It was the beginning of a phenomenon that would sweep across social media, inspire countless memes, bring families together around dinner tables, and prove that sometimes the most innocent observations from the youngest among us can reveal profound truths about life, humor, and human nature. This is the story of how Prince Louis of Wales accidentally became the world's most unexpected comedian, how a simple piano joke evolved into a global conversation about joy, spontaneity, and the magic that happens when we stop taking ourselves too seriously. It's a tale that reminds us why children see the world differently, and why sometimes that difference is exactly what we need to remember what really matters. Get ready to discover how one little prince's moment of pure, unfiltered honesty changed the way an entire generation thinks about laughter, music, and the beautiful unpredictability of childhood wisdom. The morning of September 15th started like any other day at Kensington Palace, but Catherine Middleton knew it would be anything but ordinary. As she helped 4-year-old Prince Louis button his tiny navy blazer, she couldn't help but smile at his excitement. Today marked the annual Royal Music Foundation Gala, an event that brought together world-renowned musicians, dignitaries, and philanthropists to celebrate the power of music in education. Louis had been asking about the event for weeks, ever since he overheard his older siblings, Prince George and Princess Charlotte, discussing the famous musicians who would be performing. His curiosity about music had been growing steadily, much to his parents' delight. Just last month, he had started taking basic piano lessons with Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a gentle elderly woman who had been teaching royal children for over 3 decades. Prince William stood by the window, adjusting his cufflinks while watching the grounds crew make final preparations in the palace gardens. The event would be held in the Grand Music Room, a spectacular space that had hosted countless royal gatherings over the years. The room's centerpiece was a magnificent Steinway concert grand piano, crafted in 1902 and personally selected by Queen Alexandra. Its ebony surface gleamed like a mirror, and its voice had filled the room with melodies played by some of history's greatest musicians. As the family made their way through the palace corridors, Louis skipped alongside his parents, his small hand clasped firmly in his mother's. He peppered them with questions about the piano, about the guests they would meet, and about whether he would be allowed to play. Catherine exchanged a knowing glance with William. Their youngest son had inherited the family's love of music, but he also possessed an uninhibited curiosity that sometimes led to unexpected moments. The Grand Music Room buzzed with anticipation as guests began arriving. Sir Elton John chatted animatedly with Andrew Lloyd Webber near the magnificent fireplace, while renowned pianist Lang Lang examined the historic Steinway with obvious appreciation. The Archbishop of Canterbury mingled with members of Parliament, and several foreign ambassadors discussed cultural exchange programs with representatives from the Royal Opera House. Louis observed everything with wide eyes, taking in the elegant gowns, the formal suits, and the gentle clink of champagne glasses. He had attended royal events before, but something about this gathering felt different. Perhaps it was the way everyone seemed to gravitate toward the piano, or the way conversations naturally turned to melodies and harmonies. Music had a way of bringing people together, and even at his young age, Louis could sense that magic in the air. Mrs. Hartwell spotted Louis across the room and made her way over to greet the family. She had been looking forward to seeing her newest pupil in this musical setting, curious to observe how he would react to being surrounded by professional musicians. During their lessons, she had noticed that Louis possessed an unusual ability to find humor in music, often making unexpected connections that delighted her. The formal program began with brief remarks from Prince William about the importance of music education in schools across the Commonwealth. As he spoke, Louis stood quietly beside his mother, occasionally whispering questions that she answered in hushed tones. The room's acoustics were perfect, carrying every word clearly to the assembled guests. When William concluded his speech, the first musical performance began. A string quartet from the Royal Academy of Music played a beautiful arrangement of Pachelbel's canon, their instruments singing in perfect harmony. Louis watched with fascination, his head tilting slightly as he tried to follow the intricate interplay of the violin, viola, and cello parts. Next came a vocal performance by a young soprano from the Royal Opera House, her voice soaring through an aria from Mozart's The Magic Flute. The crystalline notes seemed to dance among the chandeliers, and Louis found himself swaying slightly to the rhythm. Several guests noticed his natural response to the music and smiled at his obvious enjoyment. As the formal performances continued, Louis's attention began to wander to the magnificent Steinway piano. It sat majestically on a small raised platform, its bench positioned perfectly for a performer. During his lessons with Mrs. Hartwell, he had been learning to play on a much smaller upright piano, and the sight of this grand instrument filled him with wonder. The piano's lid was raised, revealing the complex maze of strings and hammers inside. Louis had recently learned about how pianos work during one of his lessons, and seeing the internal mechanism of such a large instrument fascinated him. He could almost imagine the hammers striking the strings, creating the beautiful sounds that had filled the room throughout the afternoon. When the scheduled performances concluded, the event transitioned into a more relaxed reception. Guests moved about freely, engaging in conversations about music, education, and the various charitable causes supported by the Royal Music Foundation. The atmosphere became less formal, with laughter and animated discussions replacing the earlier reverent attention to the performances. It was during this transition that Louis noticed something interesting. Despite the piano being the centerpiece of the room, and despite the fact that virtually every guest was somehow connected to the world of music, no one had actually played the historic Steinway during the entire event. The performances had all used smaller instruments or relied on pre-recorded accompaniments. Mrs. Hartwell found herself standing near the piano, chatting with Lang Lang about the challenges of teaching young children to appreciate classical music. They discussed the importance of making music accessible and fun, especially for students who might find traditional approaches intimidating or boring. Louis listened to their conversation with growing interest. He had learned during his lessons that music was meant to be enjoyed, not just studied or admired from a distance. Mrs. Hartwell had always encouraged him to experiment, to find his own voice at the keyboard, and to never be afraid of making mistakes. As the afternoon progressed, Louis became increasingly aware of what seemed to him like a missed opportunity. Here they were, in a room full of music lovers, celebrating the joy and power of music, with one of the world's most beautiful pianos sitting silent and unused. It struck him as oddly funny that everyone was talking about music, but no one was actually making any. The irony wasn't lost on several other guests either, though they expressed it in more subtle ways. Sir Elton John had joked quietly to Andrew Lloyd Webber about the museum quality of the event, while some of the younger musicians exchanged knowing glances about the formal constraints that often surrounded royal gatherings. But Louis, with the uninhibited perspective that only a 4-year-old can possess, saw the situation with perfect clarity. To him, it seemed as simple as the difference between talking about playing and actually playing. The solution appeared obvious, and he began to formulate what he believed was a perfectly reasonable plan. As conversations continued around him, Louis excused himself politely from his parents' side and began making his way toward the piano platform. His small feet made barely any sound on the polished marble floor, and his movement went largely unnoticed among the adult guests who were engrossed in their discussions. Catherine, engaged in a conversation with the wife of the French ambassador about children's music programs, assumed Lewis was simply exploring the room, as he often did at such events. William, discussing Commonwealth cultural initiatives with several officials, trusted that his son was safely occupied among the friendly gathering. The stage was set for a moment that would transform a formal royal gathering into something entirely unexpected, launching a story that would resonate far beyond the walls of Kensington Palace and remind the world of the pure, unfiltered wisdom that children bring to even the most sophisticated situations. Lewis approached the magnificent Steinway with the confidence that only comes from complete innocence of social conventions. To him, pianos existed to be played, not admired from a distance. He had spent enough afternoons with Mrs. Hartwell to understand that music was about expression and joy, not intimidation and formality. The piano bench, designed for adult performers, required a small climb for Lewis to reach. He managed it with the determined grace of a child accustomed to navigating a world built for much larger people. Several guests began to notice the small figure making his way onto the platform, but the conversations continued, most assuming he would simply examine the instrument and return to his parents. Mrs. Hartwell, still engaged in discussion with Lang Lang, caught sight of her young pupil approaching the piano and felt a mixture of pride and gentle concern. She knew Lewis's musical abilities were still quite basic, but she also recognized his natural affinity for finding the emotional heart of music, even in simple pieces. As Lewis settled himself on the bench, his feet dangling well above the pedals, he surveyed the keyboard before him. The keys seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, far more than the modest upright piano in his lesson room. But the arrangement was familiar enough, and he could easily identify the middle C that Mrs. Hartwell had taught him to use as his home base. The room's acoustics would amplify every sound he made, something Lewis didn't fully comprehend but instinctively respected. He placed his small hands on the keyboard, feeling the smooth ivory beneath his fingers. The weight of the keys was perfect, responsive to even his light touch. What happened next surprised everyone, including Lewis himself. Instead of attempting one of the simple melodies he had been learning, he found himself drawn to experiment with the vast range of sounds available to him. He began with a few tentative notes in the middle register, testing how the sound filled the room. The clarity and richness of the Steinway's voice were unlike anything Lewis had experienced during his lessons. Each note seemed to bloom and expand, carrying far beyond what he had expected. Encouraged by the beautiful sound, he began to explore different areas of the keyboard, discovering the deep, rumbling bass notes and the sparkling clarity of the treble register. Lang Lang stopped mid-sentence in his conversation with Mrs. Hartwell, his attention completely captured by the sounds coming from the piano. As one of the world's foremost pianists, he could immediately recognize the difference between random noise and genuine musical exploration. What he was hearing from the small prince suggested an intuitive understanding of musical color and texture. Lewis's experimentation gradually evolved into something resembling a melody. Drawing from half-remembered fragments of pieces he had heard during the afternoon's performances, he began weaving together a simple but surprisingly coherent musical narrative. His technique was elementary, but his musical instincts were remarkably sophisticated. The conversations around the room began to quiet as more guests became aware of the unexpected performance taking place. There was something mesmerizing about watching such a young child engage so fearlessly with one of the world's finest musical instruments. His complete lack of self-consciousness created an atmosphere of pure musical exploration that even seasoned professionals found compelling. Catherine and William, alerted by the changing dynamics in the room, turned to see their youngest son at the piano. Catherine's first instinct was maternal concern about proper protocol, but William placed a gentle hand on her arm, recognizing something special in what they were witnessing. Both parents understood that interrupting Lewis at this moment might rob him of a transformative musical experience. As Lewis continued to play, his confidence grew. The piano responded to his touch with such beauty that he began to understand why the adults in the room treated it with such reverence. This wasn't just an instrument. It was a voice capable of expressing emotions and ideas that words couldn't capture. The melody Lewis was creating began to take on a more defined structure. Without conscious planning, he found himself returning to certain phrases, developing them slightly each time. Mrs. Hartwell recognized elements of exercises they had worked on together, but transformed by Lewis's natural musicality into something entirely original. Sir Elton John, never one to miss a moment of genuine musical expression, moved closer to the piano platform. He could see that Lewis was entering what musicians call the zone, that magical state where technical considerations fade away and music flows directly from the heart to the instrument. The room had become completely quiet now, with every guest focused on the small figure at the piano. There was something deeply moving about witnessing such pure musical joy, unmarred by concerns about technique or performance anxiety. Lewis was simply playing for the love of making beautiful sounds, and that authenticity resonated with everyone present. As his improvised piece continued, Lewis began to incorporate some of the musical ideas he had absorbed during the afternoon's performances. Elements of the Mozart aria appeared in his treble melodies, while echoes of the string quartet's harmonies emerged in his left-hand accompaniment. He was unconsciously demonstrating the way children naturally absorb and reinterpret the artistic influences around them. Lang Lang found himself genuinely impressed by the musical logic underlying Lewis's performance. Despite his limited technical skills, the young prince was displaying an intuitive understanding of musical form and development. Each phrase seemed to lead naturally to the next, creating a sense of musical narrative that even some trained composers struggle to achieve. The improvisation reached what seemed like a natural conclusion, with Lewis returning to the simple melody that had begun his exploration. But instead of ending there, he surprised everyone by transitioning into a piece that Mrs. Hartwell immediately recognized, a simplified version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star that they had been working on during recent lessons. However, Lewis's rendition was unlike any traditional performance of the familiar children's song. He played it with such genuine expression and musical intelligence that it transcended its simple origins, becoming something approaching art. The familiar melody soared above gentle accompaniment patterns that he seemed to be inventing in real time. Mrs. Hartwell felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened. This was why she had devoted her life to teaching music to children. For moments like this, when a young mind connects with the universal language of music and discovers their own unique voice within it. As Lewis played the final notes of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, the room remained in absolute silence. The performance had been so unexpected, so genuine, and so musically satisfying that no one wanted to break the spell with premature applause. Then, Lewis, in the way that only a 4-year-old can, looked up at the room full of distinguished adults and delivered the line that would make international headlines. With perfect comic timing and complete sincerity, he announced, "Well, that's what you call a grand piano performance." The statement was so unexpected, so perfectly delivered, and so absolutely true in its childlike logic that the room erupted in the kind of laughter that comes from genuine delight rather than polite obligation. It wasn't just funny, it was profound in its simplicity. Lewis had identified exactly what had been missing from their elegant gathering: the simple joy of making music rather than just talking about it. Sir Elton John was the first to begin applauding, his genuine appreciation for what he had just witnessed overriding any concerns about protocol. Lang Lang joined him immediately, followed by Mrs. Hartwell and soon the entire room. The applause wasn't just acknowledgement of a cute moment. It was recognition of something authentically beautiful that had just taken place. Lewis, still sitting at the piano bench, looked around at the applauding adults with a mixture of pleasure and confusion. He had simply done what seemed natural to him, played music on an instrument designed for playing music. The adults' enthusiastic response suggested he had done something special, though he wasn't entirely sure what. Catherine and William made their way through the crowd to the piano platform, their faces beaming with pride and amazement. They had always known their youngest son was special, but this moment revealed depths of musical understanding and natural performance ability that they hadn't fully recognized before. As the applause finally died down, Louis looked at his parents and asked with perfect four-year-old logic, why was everyone just looking at the piano instead of playing it? Isn't that what pianos are for? His question prompted another wave of delighted laughter from the assembled guests, who were beginning to realize that they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. The formal reception had been transformed into something entirely different, a celebration not just of music education and philanthropy, but of the pure joy that music can bring when approached with an open heart and uninhibited spirit. Louis had reminded everyone present why they had fallen in love with music in the first place, before careers and responsibilities and social conventions had complicated their relationship with this universal language. The immediate aftermath of Louis's performance created an atmosphere unlike anything the royal staff had ever experienced at a formal gathering. The careful protocols and measured conversations that typically characterize such events gave way to something far more spontaneous and genuine. Guests who had been maintaining polite social distances found themselves drawn into animated discussions about music, childhood, and the magic of unexpected moments. Lang Lang, still visibly moved by what he had witnessed, approached Louis at the piano with the respect one musician shows another. He knelt down to the child's eye level and said, "That was beautiful music. Would you like to play something together?" Louis's eyes lit up with excitement at the prospect of making music with someone he instinctively recognized as a master of the instrument. What followed was an impromptu duet that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. Lang Lang positioned himself at the upper end of the keyboard, while Louis remained in the middle register where he was most comfortable. Together, they created a musical conversation that perfectly illustrated the universal nature of musical expression. Louis's simple melodies danced around Lang Lang's more sophisticated harmonies, creating moments of surprising beauty and complexity. Mrs. Hartwell watched with professional fascination as her young student responded instinctively to the musical cues from one of the world's greatest pianists. Louis seemed to understand without instruction when to play and when to listen, when to lead, and when to follow. These were skills that typically took years to develop, yet he was demonstrating them naturally in real time. Sir Elton John, not to be outdone, requested permission to join the musical collaboration. Soon, 3 generations of musicians were gathered around the historic Steinway, creating an impromptu concert that broke every rule of formal royal entertainment while perfectly embodying the true spirit of musical sharing. The other guests formed a natural semicircle around the piano, their previous conversations forgotten in favor of experiencing this unprecedented moment. Foreign ambassadors stood next to opera house administrators, government officials chatted with music teachers, and everyone found themselves united by the simple pleasure of witnessing authentic artistic expression. Lady Patricia Morrison, the Royal Music Foundation's director, realized that she was witnessing exactly what their organization had been working toward for decades: the breaking down of barriers between professional musicians and the general public, the demonstration that music belonged to everyone regardless of age or training level. Louis had accomplished in 10 minutes what years of carefully planned programming had been trying to achieve. As the impromptu concert continued, several guests began documenting the moment with their phones. The footage would later prove instrumental in sharing Louis's story with the world, but at the moment, everyone was simply trying to preserve their own memories of something they instinctively knew was special. Prince William and Catherine found themselves experiencing a complex mix of emotions. Pride in their son's natural abilities was mingled with amazement at his complete lack of performance anxiety. Most children would have been intimidated by such an august gathering, but Lewis seemed genuinely puzzled by the idea that playing piano should be anything other than joyful. The musical collaboration evolved organically, with each participant contributing according to their abilities and comfort level. Lang Lang demonstrated incredible sensitivity in adapting his playing style to complement Lewis's simpler approach, while Sir Elton John added occasional vocal flourishes that turned familiar melodies into something entirely new. Mrs. Hartwell noticed that Lewis was learning in real time, absorbing musical concepts through direct experience that might have taken weeks to communicate through traditional lessons. She watched him experiment with different rhythmic patterns, encouraged by the positive response from his musical partners, and began to understand concepts of musical dialogue and ensemble playing. The Archbishop of Canterbury, initially uncertain about the appropriateness of such spontaneous entertainment at a formal gathering, found himself genuinely moved by the demonstration of music as a force for bringing people together across all boundaries. He began to see parallels between musical harmony and the social harmony that religious communities strive to create. As news of the extraordinary event began to spread through social media, reactions started pouring in from around the world. The combination of genuine musical talent, childish humor, and royal protocol being delightfully disrupted proved irresistible to audiences everywhere. Hashtag Grand Piano Performance began trending within hours, with people sharing their own stories of children's unexpected wisdom and musical moments. Music teachers across the globe began using Lewis's example to illustrate important lessons about musical confidence and authentic expression. The video clips showed a perfect example of how music should be approached, with joy, curiosity, and complete freedom from self-consciousness. Conservatory professors found themselves discussing the importance of maintaining childlike wonder even as technical skills developed. Educational psychologists noted the significance of Lewis's approach to the unfamiliar situation. Instead of being intimidated by the grand piano's size or the distinguished audience, he had focused on the fundamental purpose of the instrument, making beautiful sounds. His ability to see past surface complications to underlying essentials demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence. The international media response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. News outlets that typically focused on political developments found themselves covering a story about music, childhood, and the power of authenticity. Editorial writers used Lewis's example to discuss everything from education reform to the importance of maintaining spontaneity in an increasingly structured world. Music industry professionals began reaching out to the Royal Music Foundation to discuss collaboration opportunities inspired by Lewis's performance. Record labels inquired about the possibility of creating children's albums that would capture the same spirit of joyful exploration. Concert organizers proposed family-friendly events that would encourage intergenerational musical sharing. Back at Kensington Palace, the extended family's reaction to the viral phenomenon was one of bemused delight. Queen Camilla laughed until she cried when she watched the video clips, while King Charles remarked that Lewis had accomplished more for music education in one afternoon than most formal programs achieved in years. The immediate impact on Lewis himself was less dramatic than the global response to his actions. He seemed genuinely puzzled by all the attention, repeatedly asking his parents why people were so excited about him playing the piano. To his 4-year-old logic, playing music was a normal and natural thing to do when confronted with a musical instrument. Mrs. Hartwell found herself fielding interview requests from music education publications around the world, all wanting to understand how she had nurtured such natural musical confidence in such a young student. She consistently redirected credit to Lewis himself, emphasizing that her role had simply been to provide a safe environment for his natural musicality to flourish. The Royal Music Foundation experienced an unprecedented surge in donations and volunteer applications in the weeks following the event. People who had never previously considered supporting music education found themselves inspired by Lewis's example to get involved in their local musical communities. Schools across the Commonwealth began implementing Prince Louis programs, initiatives designed to encourage musical exploration without the pressure of formal performance requirements. Music teachers reported increased enrollment as parents sought to provide their children with the same kind of joyful musical foundation that had produced such remarkable results. The piano used for Lewis's impromptu performance became an unexpected tourist attraction, with visitors to Kensington Palace specifically requesting to see the instrument that had hosted the famous grand piano performance. The palace staff developed special tours highlighting the musical history of the room and the importance of music in royal family life. Professional musicians began incorporating elements of Lewis's approach into their own practice routines, using his example as a reminder to maintain connection with the joy that had originally drawn them to music. Conservatory students organized Prince Louis sessions, where they would improvise freely without concern for technical perfection. The psychological impact of the event extended far beyond musical circles. Child development experts pointed to Lewis's confidence and creativity as examples of what children could achieve when allowed to explore without fear of judgment. Parent groups began discussing ways to encourage similar fearlessness in their own children's artistic endeavors. As the weeks passed, the story of Prince Louis and the piano joke continued to evolve and inspire new conversations about authenticity, creativity, and the wisdom that children bring to adult situations. What had begun as a simple moment of musical exploration had become a global phenomenon that reminded people of fundamental truths about human nature and the power of approaching life with an open heart. 3 months after the Royal Music Foundation Gala, the world was still talking about Prince Louis's piano moment. What had started as a spontaneous performance at a formal gathering had evolved into a cultural phenomenon that transcended traditional boundaries between high art and popular entertainment, royal protocol, and human authenticity. The most unexpected development was the emergence of Louis-style piano performances in concert halls around the world. Professional musicians began incorporating elements of playful improvisation into their formal recitals, creating space for the kind of joyful exploration that Louis had demonstrated. The Berlin Philharmonic premiered a Conversations with Childhood series where renowned pianists would perform alongside young students, inspired by the musical dialogue that had occurred between Louis and Lang Lang. Carnegie Hall announced a special concert series dedicated to celebrating musical spontaneity, with each performance featuring both planned repertoire and improvisational segments designed to capture the spirit of discovery that Louis had embodied. The announcement generated such interest that tickets sold out within hours, with music lovers eager to experience the kind of authentic musical connection they had witnessed in the viral videos from Kensington Palace. Louis himself remained remarkably unaffected by his newfound fame, though his musical education had taken some interesting turns. Mrs. Hartwell found that her young pupil's confidence at the keyboard had grown exponentially since his experience with the grand piano. He approached each lesson with even greater enthusiasm, often asking if they could make the music dance the way it had during his performance with the professional musicians. The technical aspects of Louis's playing began improving rapidly, not through increased pressure or formal drilling, but through his enhanced enthusiasm for musical exploration. Mrs. Hartwell observed that his experience of being taken seriously as a musical collaborator by world-class musicians had given him a sense of belonging in the musical world that typically took years to develop. International music educators began studying the Louis phenomenon as a case study in natural musical development. Dr. Sarah Chun, a researcher at the Royal Academy of Music, published a paper analyzing how Louis's uninhibited approach to the piano had demonstrated principles of musical learning that contradicted many traditional pedagogical assumptions. Her research suggested that confidence and joy were more important factors in early musical development than technical precision or formal training. The broader cultural impact of Louis's story continued to evolve in unexpected directions. Children's book publishers commissioned a series of stories inspired by the grand piano performance, creating narratives that encouraged young readers to approach challenges with courage and creativity. The books became bestsellers, with parents and teachers using them to discuss themes of confidence, authenticity, and the importance of trying new things. Documentary filmmakers began working on a feature-length exploration of the event and its aftermath, interviewing everyone from the original guests at the gala to music teachers in remote schools who had been inspired to change their teaching methods after watching Lewis's performance. The documentary, tentatively titled The Grand Piano Principle, promised to examine how one child's moment of pure expression had influenced educational practices around the world. The Royal Music Foundation experienced a transformation that exceeded their most optimistic projections. The organization's mission to make music education accessible to all children gained momentum that no amount of traditional fundraising could have generated. Schools that had been cutting music programs found new funding sources as communities rallied to ensure their children could have access to the kind of musical foundation that had produced such remarkable results. Lady Patricia Morrison found herself traveling internationally to speak about music education, using Lewis's example to illustrate the importance of creating environments where children feel safe to experiment and express themselves authentically. Her presentations consistently filled auditoriums, with educators and parents eager to understand how they could nurture similar confidence in their own young people. The psychological research community took particular interest in Lewis's story as an example of what researchers began calling authentic confidence, the kind of self-assurance that emerges from genuine engagement with one's interests rather than from external validation or competitive achievement. Child development specialists began recommending that parents observe Lewis's approach as a model for encouraging their children's natural talents. Mrs. Hartwell received invitations to present her teaching methods at conferences around the world, though she consistently emphasized that her success with Lewis had more to do with providing space for his natural abilities than with any particular technique. She developed a presentation called Teaching the Teacher: What Children Show Us About Learning, that became one of the most requested sessions at music education conferences. The piano performance videos continue to circulate on social media, but their impact evolved beyond simple entertainment. Therapists began using the clips in their work with children who struggled with performance anxiety, showing them an example of what was possible when someone approached a challenging situation with joy rather than fear. The videos became tools for discussing emotional resilience and the power of focusing on purpose rather than obstacles. Lang Lang, deeply moved by his experience collaborating with Lewis, established a scholarship fund specifically for young pianists who demonstrated what he called the Lewis spirit, a combination of musical intuition, fearless expression, and genuine love for making music. The first recipients of the scholarship were selected not based on technical proficiency alone, but on their ability to approach music with the same kind of joyful authenticity that Lewis had displayed. Sir Elton John incorporated a segment inspired by Lewis's performance into his farewell tour, dedicating a portion of each concert to improvisational collaboration with young local musicians. These segments became highlights of the shows, with audiences consistently responding with the same kind of delighted recognition that had filled the Grand Music Room at Kensington Palace. The academic world began examining Lewis's story through various theoretical frameworks. Sociologists analyzed it as an example of how children could challenge adult assumptions about appropriate behavior and reveal hidden truths about social structures. Musicologists studied the improvisation as a demonstration of how musical understanding could transcend formal training. Educational theorists used it to support arguments for more play-based learning approaches. As Lewis's 6th birthday approached, his parents began planning a celebration that would acknowledge his impact while maintaining focus on his normal childhood development. They decided to host a small musical gathering at Kensington Palace, inviting the same guests who had been present for the original piano moment, along with some of the children who had been inspired by his example. The birthday celebration became an opportunity to observe how Lewis had grown and changed since his moment of global recognition. Mrs. Hartwell noted that while his musical abilities had continued developing rapidly, his essential character remained unchanged. He still approached the piano with the same joy and curiosity that had captivated the world, but now with enhanced technical skills that allowed him to express his musical ideas more effectively. During the birthday celebration, Lewis performed a piece he had been working on, a simple composition of his own creation that he called the Laughing Song. The piece perfectly captured the spirit of his original improvisation while demonstrating significant growth in his understanding of musical structure and harmony. The performance reminded everyone present why his original piano moment had been so compelling. It wasn't about technical virtuosity, but about genuine musical communication. The gift table at Lewis's birthday party included presents from children around the world who had been inspired by his story. Letters and drawings arrived from young musicians in dozens of countries, all expressing gratitude for showing them that music could be approached with confidence and joy. Parents wrote to thank Lewis for inspiring their children to try new things without fear of making mistakes. One particularly touching letter came from a 7-year-old girl in Australia who had been too shy to participate in her school's music program until she watched Lewis's performance. She wrote, "Dear Prince Lewis, you showed me that pianos are for playing, not just for looking at. Now I play piano too, and I'm not scared anymore. Thank you for teaching me that it's okay to try things even if you're little." The international response to Lewis's birthday celebration demonstrated that his influence had become truly global. Music schools in Japan organized Lewis Day celebrations where students performed their own improvisational pieces. Children's hospitals in Canada used his story as part of their music therapy programs. Community centers in Brazil started piano programs specifically designed to encourage the kind of fearless exploration that Lewis had demonstrated. As the celebration concluded and guests prepared to leave, Mrs. Hartwell reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a 4-year-old's simple desire to play a beautiful piano. What had emerged was a worldwide conversation about authenticity, courage, and the wisdom that children bring to adult situations. Lewis's grand piano performance had become something much larger than entertainment. It had become a reminder of fundamental truths about human nature and the power of approaching life with an open heart. The evening ended with an impromptu sing-along, led by Lewis himself, of the song that had become unofficial anthem of his global fan community. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star performed with the same spirit of joyful exploration that had started it all. As voices joined together in harmony, filling the grand music room with music that was both simple and profound, it was clear that the impact of one child's moment of authentic expression would continue inspiring people for years to come. 2 years had passed since Prince Lewis's spontaneous piano performance at the Royal Music Foundation Gala, and the ripple effects of that moment continued to expand in ways that no one could have predicted. What had begun as a child's innocent observation about the purpose of musical instruments had evolved into a global movement that was changing how people thought about creativity, authenticity, and the courage to express oneself. The most tangible legacy was the establishment of the Grand Piano Performance Initiative, an international program that brought together music educators, child psychologists, and performance artists to develop new approaches to music education. The initiative, funded by a coalition of music foundations and inspired directly by Lewis's example, had established pilot programs in over 30 countries, all designed to encourage the kind of fearless musical exploration that Lewis had demonstrated. Dr. Sarah Chun, now the director of the initiative, had spent the past year documenting the remarkable results emerging from schools that had implemented Lewis-inspired teaching methods. Children who had previously shown little interest in formal music lessons were engaging enthusiastically with programs that emphasized play and exploration over technical precision. Test scores in these programs showed not only improved musical abilities, but enhanced confidence, creativity, and willingness to take on challenges in other academic areas. The research findings were revolutionary for the field of music education. Traditional approaches that emphasized correct technique and formal structure were being supplemented with methods that prioritized emotional connection and authentic expression. The results suggested that Lewis's instinctive approach to music had been pedagogically sound in ways that decades of formal research were only beginning to understand. Mrs. Hartwell, now in her 70s but more energetic than ever, had become something of a celebrity in music education circles. Her teaching philosophy, refined through her experience with Lewis and informed by the subsequent research, was being adopted by music schools around the world. She had written a book titled The Wisdom of Musical Children that became required reading for music education students at major universities. The book's central thesis was that children possessed natural musical intelligence that formal training often inadvertently suppressed rather than enhanced. Mrs. Hartwell argued that Lewis's performance had been remarkable not because it was unusual for a child to have such musical intuition, but because it was unusual for a child to have the confidence to express that intuition in front of an adult audience. Lewis himself, now 6 years old, had continued developing as a musician while maintaining the joyful approach that had made him famous. His lessons with Mrs. Hartwell had evolved into something more like collaborative exploration than traditional instruction. He was composing simple pieces regularly, each one reflecting his continued fascination with making music that told stories and expressed emotions. His musical development had been carefully documented by researchers interested in understanding how natural talent developed in an environment free from performance pressure. The study showed that Lewis's technical skills were progressing rapidly, but more importantly, his musical imagination was flourishing in ways that suggested he might genuinely pursue music as a serious interest as he grew older. The annual celebration of Grand Piano Performance Day had become an international phenomenon, observed in schools and community centers around the world. The day was dedicated to encouraging musical experimentation and celebrating the kind of authentic expression that Lewis had demonstrated. Children everywhere were encouraged to approach musical instruments with the same fearless curiosity that had made Lewis's original performance so compelling. The celebration had evolved beyond simply commemorating Lewis's moment to become a broader advocacy for child-centered approaches to arts education. Teachers used the day to implement experimental teaching methods, parents organized family music-making sessions, and communities held concerts featuring children's original compositions. The psychological impact of Lewis's story had proven to be as significant as its musical influence. Child therapists regularly used videos of his performance to help young patients understand that trying new things didn't require perfection, only courage and authentic engagement. The clips had become standard tools in treating childhood anxiety and building confidence in children who struggled with self-doubt. Dr. Michael Torres, a leading researcher in childhood resilience, had published extensively on what he called the Lewis effect, the phenomenon of children gaining confidence through observing peer models who approach challenges with joy rather than anxiety. His research showed that children who watched Lewis's performance were significantly more likely to attempt new activities themselves, suggesting that authentic confidence was remarkably contagious. The commercial impact of Lewis's story had been carefully managed by the royal family to ensure that any financial benefits supported music education rather than personal profit. A licensing agreement allowed the production of educational materials and musical instruments designed specifically for young children, with all proceeds funding music programs in underserved communities. The Little Lewis piano had become one of the most popular children's instruments worldwide, designed to capture the responsiveness and beautiful tone quality that had made Lewis's original performance possible. Music stores reported that sales of beginner pianos had increased dramatically, with parents specifically requesting instruments that would allow their children to experience the joy of making beautiful music from their very first attempts. Lang Lang had incorporated his experience with Lewis into his ongoing advocacy for music education, regularly referencing their impromptu duet in speeches and presentations around the world. He established an annual masterclass series called Musical Conversations, where professional musicians collaborated with young students, creating the same kind of intergenerational musical dialogue that had emerged spontaneously at Kensington Palace. The series had been so successful that it was now broadcast internationally, with millions of viewers tuning in to watch the magical moments that occurred when experienced musicians approach collaboration with children as equals rather than students. The programs consistently demonstrated that musical communication transcended age and training level when approached with mutual respect and genuine curiosity. Sir Elton John's scholarship fund for young musicians had distributed over £1 million to support children who demonstrated Lewis's combination of musical talent and joyful approach to performance. The recipients, known as Little Eltons, had gone on to achieve remarkable success not only in music, but in various fields, suggesting that the confidence and creativity fostered through authentic musical engagement had benefits far beyond the concert hall. The scholarship program had also sparked broader conversations about how talent identification and support could be improved across all artistic disciplines. Traditional audition processes that emphasized technical perfection were being supplemented with assessment methods that looked for the qualities Lewis had displayed: natural musical instinct, fearless expression, and genuine love for the artistic process. As Lewis approached his 7th birthday, media interest in his story remained high, but the focus had shifted from celebrating a cute royal moment to analyzing a cultural phenomenon that continued to influence educational practice and child development theory worldwide. Academic conferences regularly featured panels discussing the implications of his story for various fields of study. The upcoming birthday celebration was planned as both a personal milestone for Lewis and an opportunity to assess the broader impact of his influence on global culture. Researchers from universities around the world would be gathering data on how Lewis-inspired programs were performing, while musicians and educators would share stories of the young people who had been influenced by his example. Mrs. Hartwell, now preparing for her own retirement, reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple piano lesson and evolved into an international movement. She had received honorary doctorates from 3 universities and been invited to advise education ministries in over a dozen countries, all because she had trusted a 4-year-old boy's instinct that pianos existed to be played with joy rather than approached with trepidation. The evening before Lewis's 7th birthday, the family gathered in the same grand music room where his famous performance had taken place. The historic Steinway still occupied its place of honor, but now it was surrounded by smaller instruments that had been added to encourage musical experimentation by visitors of all ages. Lewis sat at the familiar bench and began playing a piece he had composed for the occasion, a musical reflection on his journey from that first spontaneous performance to his current understanding of himself as a young musician with a unique story to tell. The piece incorporated themes from his original improvisation while demonstrating the sophisticated musical understanding he had developed through 2 years of continued exploration. As he played, his family listened with the same mixture of pride and wonder that had characterized their reaction to his original performance. But now they also understood the broader significance of what they were witnessing, not just a talented child making music, but the continuation of a story that had reminded people around the world of fundamental truths about human nature and the power of approaching life with courage, authenticity, and joy. The piece concluded with a gentle statement of "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," the melody that had become symbolic of his influence, played with such mature musical understanding that it served as both a nostalgic callback to his original performance and a demonstration of how far he had traveled on his musical journey. As the final note faded in the elegant room, Prince William placed his hand on his son's shoulder and said, "You know, Lewis, you really did show everyone what a grand piano performance could be." Lewis smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had never doubted that pianos existed to create joy, and replied, "I just played the music that was already there waiting for someone to find it." In that moment, the family understood that the real legacy of Lewis's famous piano joke wasn't the global attention or the educational reforms or the research studies that have followed. The true legacy was the reminder that authentic expression, whether musical, artistic, or simply human, required nothing more than the courage to be genuinely oneself and that sometimes the most profound wisdom came from the youngest and most innocent voices among us. The story of Prince Louis and his grand piano performance had become more than entertainment, more than a royal anecdote, more than even an educational phenomenon. It had become a modern parable about the power of authenticity, the wisdom of children, and the magic that happens when we approach life's grandest instruments, whether musical or metaphorical, with open hearts and fearless joy.